Hey, this is Mike Lindsay from Vital MX. We're in Cairo, Georgia at the Star Racing Yamaha facility. It is formerly known as the Goat Farm. Albeit if you were ever here back in the day, they have really overhauled this place. It doesn't look pretty much anything like it used to. And it was a really cool experience. We got to come out here and spend a day testing the 2023 Yamaha YZ450. Yamaha put a lot of effort into this intro, and for good reason. This is probably the most radically changed bike that they've come up with in the 450 class, and it's the first time they turned the cylinder around backwards. There is a massive list of improvements on this bike, way more than we realized even after checking out the initial press release and info dump on this bike. So much, in fact, if you want to learn about all the technical changes, hit the link in our description below. There's a separate video about it, and that's so we can jump in and give you guys more of our opinions and thoughts while riding this machine. Starting off with the ergonomics, I think it's one of the bigger changes on the Yamaha and one of the biggest complaints that people have had the past few years. Yes, this bike has had a very comfortable chassis. It's had great suspension for years. It's had a super powerful engine. It's had a power tuning app where you could change all that. But when people try this bike, one of their biggest complaints is still related to the ergonomics. And slowly as we've rode this bike more and more over the years, it's kind of come down to a very unusual rider triangle. You had a very short foot peg to seat height, so your knees kind of felt like you're up in your chest. They've been putting the bars really forward on to try to open it up, and all that just kind of felt awkward. The more you ride the Yamaha, the better it gets, but it just never feels quite perfect. So biggest thing they did here is they dropped the foot pegs 5 millimeters down on the brackets, and they moved them back 5 millimeters. They also made the seat 5 millimeters thicker technically, so you have 10 millimeters more distance between the pegs and the seat, and they move those pegs back to try to get you back and more opened up on the bike. With that, they've reverted the bar mount position back to the back hole, so it feels just a lot more neutral now. A lot of guys always jump on, say, Hondas, and they just feel that rider triangle just feels so natural. The Yamaha is really close to that now, and that just brings a lot of instant comfort on the bike, even before you get on the track. If you're a bit on the shorter side, you might be a little bit nervous after hearing that. Well, I'm 5'9", but I got the inseam of somebody that's got about 5'5" legs, so I'm used to it. It's still very comfortable. We have tried some lower pegs on the outgoing generation bike, and I really liked it. When you go out first lap, it's just much easier to open up your legs, to actuate them, get on the balls of your feet, and use your legs correctly on the motorcycle. As you go from sitting to standing, it just kind of opens that all up, makes it a lot easier to control the bike. Now, the other big thing with the leg side of things is the connection of the motorcycle. They really worked on all their body work. And the biggest thing for everybody that's complained about, oh, the Yamaha feels so big up at the radiator shrouds, it's so bulky. Is all that material is gone up on top of the shrouds. They finally got rid of the intakes being a part of the shroud and leading into the airbox. Now the airbox draws from behind through the seat, around the bottom, and they got rid of the big horns on the top of the shrouds. They got rid of those big intake vents. So you don't have all this material up high anymore. And beyond that, they've changed the radiator layout, and the bike is 2 inches thinner at its biggest point of that radiator shroud, and you'll have all that material on top. They've also taken the airbox and kind of moved it down in the bike more. They've lowered the frame spars. They've moved the fuel tank farther back in the bike. This has made better mass centralization, as they've always been going for. And it gives it ergonomics that just feel more like a standard bike you'd be used to, more like the Kaways, the Hondas. There's less awkward and uniqueness now to this Yamaha layout. With that, it's a lot thinner between the legs. It's a lot easier to control. The connection between the rider and the bike is definitely improved there. So between the rider triangle and the huge update to the airbox, it has really brought the Yamaha to a direction I think most people have really been waiting for. As for the engine side of things, there's a massive amount of updates in here. The majority of them is to try to get engine parts lighter, to try to get less friction in the engine between a plain bearing on the crank, plain bearing on the cams. They've changed the oiling system dramatically in this bike, 2 oil pumps, a dry sump to help lubricate. Either way you look at the engine, the cases are thinner enough that the bike has 20 millimeters better ground clearance because the crankcase volume has changed so much. They've been able to bring the cradle and the frame up a lot. So even in really deep bottom out situations here, I was really surprised. Never really felt, as you're rolling through rollers, you had a little more confidence the bike wasn't going to catch or hang up on anything. The engine itself still follows the path that Yamaha has been going for a long time now. We have this super torquey, broad 450, but what they've done by raising the rev limiter 500 RPM, by changing all these parts throughout the engine, we have power that's even broader than it's been, to the point that riding the bike the first couple laps, I would swear that the gear ratios have changed. And they made a very good point of that. Hey, we changed the transmission, but the final ratios are nearly identical. I wouldn't believe that. Second gear feels so much longer than it ever has before, and third as well. Go Farm track here is pretty quick in a lot of places. You could probably ride this entire track in second gear. I actually tried a couple laps. It's definitely revved down a few places, but you could do this entire track in second gear, and I think most people's local track you could. Getting up above third on this track was basically near impossible. The power again is just so broad and usable. What's really unique is it has a very connected feel. You grab a handful, you can lift the front end very easily on this bike. It kind of feels like it's gonna get away from you, but at the same time, after that initial connected hit, it's a very linear power. So it just pulls smoothly, so it kind of tricks your brain. You're like, I know I'm accelerating quickly. I can see the ground going by pretty fast right now, but it just kind of keeps building at such a linear rate that it's easier to stay forward on the bike as it's driving than I really expected. We played around a lot with the mapping options. They've changed the app quite a bit, which is still free to use, which is awesome. Instead of having to change all the numbers, which you still can on the ignition fuel map, now they have a very simple slider. If the bike starts at the base map at a 5, going up to 10 is the most aggressive, and going down to 1 is really smooth. And if you just take that slider and move it back and forth, it kind of pre-adjusts some mapping for you. With that, I also tried in some built-in maps, such as their torque, linear torque map. There's a torque control map, a few other things like that. There are different variations of making the power even smoother, because the stock bike, it is really fun. The mid-range is maybe a little too aggressive for me, even in some of the softer conditions. The RPM build is a little faster than I'd like. So trying some of those smoother options they had, it was really fun because it would draw the power out longer, make that mid-range feel even more drawn out, which sounds insane considering how much we're talking about the broadness. But it did take away some of that initial hit, so we could play with some of the connection. As we talked about, there's a lot of weight out of this bike. They've removed a lot of inertia and friction at the top of the engine. They have condensed everything even more on the mass centralization, trying to bring more things to the center of the bike, and even just physical parts such as the frame, wiring harness, and other things. Like I said, we're down almost 5.5 pounds, about 5.3. We now have a bike that full of fuel should weigh around 240, maybe about 2-3 pounds at most more than the KTM. We think it's about a pound or two lighter than the Cowie now. With the conditions here being a lot different, being really deep, loamy, clay in the morning, ripped real nice, some of the traction levels weren't as comparable to the hard pack conditions we ride. So the first couple things I was feeling out again was that power level, the rider's cockpit, those ergonomics, and also the agility of the bike. All these things they've done between dropping the weight, changing the mass up high, changing the friction and inertia. Not only is the physical weight down, but the bike is so much more playful. Between the connection of the rider and how easy it is to throw around, I was really impressed if you're going, say, from a right-hand corner really quickly to a left, when you have to transition, bring the bike up and lay it back over, how easily it does that. Even when you're under throttle, where the old bike would kind of grab and stand itself up a little bit more under heavy throttle openings, this bike just kind of lean up and then lean back down without that much effort, without that much input. And again, with that on power feeling, something I noticed is how much easier the bike is to keep leaned over now. So middle to exit, I always felt like the Yamahas, again, with all that torque and power, they'd kind of pick themselves up a little bit point and shoot at times. The bike just kind of keeps carving, it keeps leaned over without you having to get on top of the side shroud and really having to put your outside foot weight into it and trying to keep it down. This bike just stays down a little bit easier. Definitely better for me on mid to exit, which is an area I struggle with. I'm stronger on entry to middle of corners. I've always struggled with middle to exit on longer corners, trying to keep that lean angle, stay on throttle. I tend to oversteer and just stand up. Definitely one of the better experiences I've had on a bike out of the box in that situation. As for the suspension side, I did mention they still have the SSS spring fork on this bike. The fork and shock itself, the components are really the same as the outgoing bike. If you have kit suspension or something from the old bike, it'll bolt on this. However, we do have new settings stock, enough that Yamaha went through the effort on the whole weight loss of trying air forks again. They even tried a sort of production version of the hybrid fork that Tomac raced on this year, and even though those components have improved, they still felt like the weight penalty of being on the spring fork was worth it and went ahead and stayed with it. And I think, Yamaha never switched over during the air fork era, and I know a lot of people were really pumped on that. And again, just the natural connected feel, the feedback you get of the coil spring is definitely nice for guys that feed off that input on corner entry. For a long time, the Yamaha has been very plush. Now, the problem is if suspension is soft and plush, the bike can teeter-totter a lot. which can make it feel heavy because it'll dive under braking, it'll squat heavy under acceleration, the bike's always moving, that kind of wears you out, and it makes it difficult to set up for sections when it never feels settled. The past few years, they've focused very much on getting the bike stiffer, getting the ride height more level, so it doesn't do that, it doesn't teeter, it doesn't dive, but without giving up comfort. And this bike is another step in that area. The balance is fantastic out of the box, the stability is fantastic. The way it acts under heavy braking, under acceleration, it's still plush, it still moves, but it's definitely a little bit better balance than it's ever been. However, my changes were based on still improving that balance a bit. They are starting pretty high on the sag. I think we were about 96, 97 this morning. I immediately went to about 100. That was better in some situations, but I lost some front end feel. So we split the difference. I think we ended up at about 98 millimeters. We ended up softening the high speed a little bit, which helped under braking, keeping the bike squatted, keeping it straight. Under the base setting, I kind of would lift out of the stroke a little bit on the rear and dance, taking out that high speed, just settled it down enough that even under the couple decent braking sections we had here, I was pretty impressed, even when I didn't have good leg connection with the bike, that it really wouldn't step out and it would just keep driving straight. As for the forks, I am a little bit on the heavier side right now. I'm just under 200 pounds, so a tick over the stock 450 weight goal. I had a little bit of dive character under heavy braking here. Again, what really impressed me, and even took me a minute to discern it, is the bike wouldn't, shake the front end under heavy braking like that. It didn't feel unstable. I could just feel a lot more weight going to the front end than I wanted. Taking some sag out, taking some high speed definitely helped balance it. But on the fork side, I had to go anywhere from 2 to 4 clicks stiffer. I was kind of dancing around depending on the conditions to get it up in the mid-stroke a little bit more and not quite get so deep under the heavy braking situations. Couple last little key things to talk about ergonomics wise or control wise. Yes, the bike we rode today has cable clutch. That's what it'll come stock on the showroom floor, whether you buy the stock bike, the Monster Energy Edition, whatever, it's gonna come with a cable clutch. The hydraulic GYTR clutch is gonna be available in early spring. It's gonna be around $300. I didn't personally play with it today. I'm quite a fan of cable clutch. Really stoked they have the option to be able to switch them back and forth for the guys that want it. Also, the controls for all the mapping, all the launch control, traction control, all that has been simplified. There is now just one kill switch and one button to switch between maps or to lock in your launch control. And you can even use that button as a timer. Again, the app has been built out so much better now. You can turn on and off traction control, low, mid, high on different engine maps. You can switch your maps there a lot easier. So they were able to condense it down instead of having so many buttons on the bike, try to bring it down, make it a little bit more simple. You don't have as many on the fly changes, but I don't think that's a big deal. First time people get this, they play with it more. Once they lock in, they usually don't finick with the button as much during the moto. All in all, I'm gonna kind of give you the same adage we mostly do when we go outside of our comfort zone in terms of testing, because we do ride the same few tracks over and over. That's where our baseline is. I don't have all the answers after riding here today. I was genuinely impressed. I don't really have much of a list of complaints really coming out of this with this bike. Part of that, again, is the dirt. The traction levels are different. Overall, just again, basing it off the prior Yamahas, we have way better ergonomics, just massively improved there. It has dropped the weight. It really kind of feels like, I hate to say it's like a normal dirt bike now. There isn't so much weirdness to the Yamaha anymore. The power plant has only gone better. I don't see any negative in the power anywhere. I think it's grown at all ends. It's way more tunable even than it's ever been before. That's all positive. Really, I think where people will just come into this is the suspension work for you out of the box? That's always a question mark with any bike. I think they've got a great base setting. I think they have pretty good base balance. It can still be improved a little bit with some of the things we did and could be further depending on your track situation. I do think, like I said, they lean a little bit more towards the plush side. Some guys might want a little more hold up. But again, this has all been moved in the correct direction. So if you've rode a Yamaha before, I really can't find anything about this bike that I think is worse than the outgoing Yamaha. One of the only negatives I could come out of this with is maybe the ergonomics. If you were a fan of the outgoing Yamaha, maybe you're not gonna like the change on the ergos as much, but I think for 80–90% of the dudes out there, it will fit you more. It will be more like every other bike you've jumped on. I think that is a vast improvement, at least for me and almost all the guys I talked to here. Again, a lot to talk about this bike. We're really excited to bring it into Shootout. If you have any questions, any thoughts, throw it in the comments section. Love to answer it. If you like this content, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and check out more on VitalMX.com.